President Emeritus, distinguished guests, I'd like to thank the Tumas Fenech Foundation, first of all, for this important initiative. And just this Tuesday, last Tuesday, the Cabinet discussed a paper, a proposal for a national strategy on financial literacy. So there we go. And it was meant for pensioners. And what I said in Cabinet is, let's hold on, because the financial service industry is interested, and I know the stock exchange, the MFSA, have been doing it for many years. The pension from the social service, definitely they would be interested, but so is education, and so are journalists. So I think we should now, perhaps even after this meeting, discuss how we can have this national strategy without excluding any sector. It is true that pensioners need education and financial, but also so are journalists. Journalists, like us, receive bits of news, China here, stock exchange there, a bit up, a bit down, a story about BEPS, what Moscovici said, and so on and so forth. And it's sometimes they too find it very hard to take a pair of wings and go up and see it as a whole picture. Well, to make sense of all this happening around the world. And I think we should do that, because it's no use every time about these cliches that the financial sector is very important for Malta, that our reputation we've always, which are all true, very true and very important, that we've got our reputation as a priority, that will safeguard our advantages, and so on and so forth. But I would like to go back some years. President Emeritus Mr. Bonici just showed me a photo of us together in 1987. There you are. So let's start from 87 and see how both worldwide and also in Malta things developed. I think what we're seeing today, I think if I were to summarize, is that what was acceptable then is no longer acceptable now, in terms of regulation, in terms of practices, in terms of activity. Now we're talking about a financial service industry. I remember as a student I was very fascinated in year one of my economics course. Savings, this was the Keynesian equation. Savings equal investment. And I never could understand how this could always be equal. And Keynes had this explanation that income will go up, down, until the two equate each other. And the economy will never be stable unless they equal. So we're talking very simply about people, a set of people, for different reasons from the investors, who want to save. They want to save for the future, they want to save to buy a car, they want to save to buy a house, they want to save for their retirement. And then you've got a set of entrepreneurs, completely different from these savers, who are of a different kind, who want to invest, who want to look at the future and build projects and use this money. And now you have an intermediary, and that's where the financial industry is all about. Is how, so all these stock exchanges, banks, insurance companies and so on, it's a question of all that money being saved by a set of people gets transferred to these set of people who are the investors. And we can say today how sophisticated it has become. There were times where we were referring to it as a rocket science. I still remember being in the every year there's a group of, it's called the Group of 30, they meet in the Fed, and I just got invited there. And I still remember in the elevator there were two chairmen of big banks, don't need to mention them, but I remember, and I was with them, and they were coming down with the security to the ground floor. And this chairman turned to the other, said, "Jack, have you understood anything about it?" The other chairman said, "No." It was all about derivatives, about this. So even chairman of banks, I still remember the regulators talking about institutional funds. These are not for the men in the street or the women in the street, but they were meant for institutional investors, big ones, banks with big money, millions for this fund, and the regulators say, I mean, these are the experts. They don't need hand-holding. They don't need a prospectus to tell them what the risks are, and therefore leave them alone. Well, that's what we did. But we thought they knew what they were doing. Well, now we know that they were not really so much know what they were doing, and as a result, many collapsed, and even involving Nobel Prize winners in the case of one of them. So let's go back to the 87. At that time, we're talking about criteria, I mean, about the values changing. First was the question of transparency and secrecy, its counterpart. At that time, we were, very easygoing about it. The same for tax avoidance or tax evasion. I'm not talking about the national level, but at the international level. Companies, multinational, that's their advantage, playing one against each other, transfer payments, and that's the advantage of multinationals. And if you get them, it's good for you. The same for supervision and other regulations. And in fact, let's put it this way. Malta, at that time, in 87, 88, we had the audacity to say, let's turn Malta into a tax haven, into an offshore financial center. And immediately we conformed and turned our comprehensive legislation, and that was a big job, and would like to be thankful to all those who were involved at that time in 94, and they turned Malta into a non-shore legislation similar to other financial centers in the European Union. But still, things are indeed changing. What this financial landscape has changed is, although there were people and sectors and institutions pushing for change, they didn't have the clout, they didn't have the wind in their sails. And the wind in their sails came with the biggest financial crisis of 2008. And this was such a big earthquake or tsunami which devastated countries and banks and whatnot. And as a result, gave the wind in the sails of those who told you, we told you that before. And that's why immediately the legislators on both sides of the Atlantic set up into rethinking and adding to the legislation. It was a non-stop job in the European Parliament and also in Congress in thinking of all the legislation one could think which would make supervision stricter, regulate any activity without any exclusion, and still, we're still going on. At the moment, we are talking about the Volcker rule, whether banks should be divided and put the commercial side on one side and independent from the investment arm of that bank. So, as I said, in fact, I was in the Parliament and introduced the bill about the creation of a centralized credit register in Malta at the central bank, whereby they will collect all the data about individuals and companies' debt over 5,000. And there was a member of Parliament from the opposition, and I could understand. He said, where are we coming to? I mean, there's no more privacy, and this is not acceptable, and this is a savage way of, and so on and so forth. And I explained. I said, yes, you're correct. That's intrusion on the person's individual, on his confidentiality, and so on. However, when you put it side by what happened because of the lack of transparency and the lack of that secrecy, and is that debts grew, and that is what brought the financial crisis about. Simply public and private debts. And therefore, we have to be very watchful on the kind of debt. And whoever wants to borrow from one institution, the risk assessment must be, it's in his interest, or in the company's interest, that the risk is not imagined, because if you're not sure about how much exposed that company is, you'd say, okay, I charge you this amount of interest. But knowing from other banks through the central bank, we're not talking about bank accounts, we're not even talking about the name of the bank, but the person of the company would know how much it is exposed. And therefore, when a loan is given, that would be quite realistic to the risk involved, and banks can then compete on commercial grounds and not because they assume the risk differently. And the same for taxation. Who would ever have thought that taxation and revenue commissioners from one country would automatically exchange the information about a person's bank accounts? Now, not only have we done it with the Savings Directive in the European Union, but even I've signed an international agreement in Berlin whereby we exchange information with other third countries. And we are still delivering on what we're doing in order for that to apply. So this has changed the landscape completely. And this is where journalists must understand the force of it. It's no longer the Brussels. We're always blaming Brussels for this and Brussels for that. Now it's coming at the highest level, the G20, asking the OECD to take it in hand. So we have, and Malta is proud to have complied, but both on the anti-money laundering legislation and implementation, on the question of transparency, and now the latest is about harmful tax competition. It goes back to the 1994-95 when the OECD issued its first definition of a harmful tax competition, which distinguishes between using taxation to attract business, but in a harmful way, whereby you treat ring fencing for the locals as against foreigners. And now we have the BEPS report with the, I believe, 15 recommendations. And now they are going to be taken up by the Commission, and at the end of the month, they will issue the bill for 2 directives. And this will affect us very much, and we're working very hard to make our position clear. If I may clarify a bit, is that we are ready to comply or compromise, but not on our taxation system. Our taxation system was not built in '94 so that we'll have a financial service center. It was built after the war. It was a remnant of the British route, so to speak, as the full imputation system. And this is what we have. And the whole system, it affects not just the financial services or the iGaming, it affects manufacturing. It affects even a pensioner would get a full refund if he's not liable to tax. So it's a system. Now, within that system, we have to show and convince the Commission that we want to retain it. This is ours, and there's no reason why we should not keep it. However, we are all for, in other words, we would join forces against tax evasion. We are against a company not practicing double non-taxation. So our system does, in a way, it allows for that company to pay taxation elsewhere. We'll see how things developed after the issue of this. So it's a very, there's no such thing as a dull day in the financial service sector. At the same time, you have an industry, and here the regulator is so important, because by adapting and by being innovative, we always stay a step ahead. And this is what Malta is doing. We have now a nucleus of expertise, of professional people in various fields, in the legal field, in the accountancy field, and the IT and so on, who together have got the experience, again, to stay ahead. Always to stay ahead, because even every regulation is, creates a challenge or a problem, if you want to like that, but also creates an opportunity. And that's where the regulator, working with the industry closely, they can stay ahead. In conclusion, we need we cannot put our head in the sand. There are some practitioners, I must say, who want to retain everything at all costs and over our dead body type of approach. You can't play that game now with the G20 OECD type of standards. You have to address the issue, you have to discuss, you have to engage, you have to compromise in order to retain your advantage. Malta has got various advantages, and we don't need to fear change because, as I said, we are well prepared for it. I think I'll stop here.